It's really people who are brilliant at what they do, demonstrating their brilliance, and then talking about how they achieve that. And it's a very inspirational concept, actually, and it's worked very well.
It's getting late. I'm making my way over to my favorite place. Gotta get my body moving, shake the stress away.
Jamie Cullum, a young man who I had something to do with his success, I suppose, and I gave him his first break on television and on radio. A young man called Jonathan Yeo, who's a very fine portrait painter, who painted my portrait for the National Portrait Gallery. That's not why he got the job. And then we've got Michael Morpurgo, the author, who wrote Warhorse, of course, who, again, is an extraordinary exposition of what you have to do to be a writer. You know, don't wait for the bird of paradise to alight. Sit down and write every day of your life. That's the message that you'll get. Carlos Acosta, an extraordinary story, this young man. I mean, he was a down and out, a delinquent in Cuba, one of 9, 10 children, his father in prison. He was headed for a life of delinquency, and all of a sudden, 10 years later, he becomes a principal ballet dancer at the Royal Ballet. How does that happen? Demonstrate to us, if you would, an example of that, of the marrying of two different kinds of music into something which is more than acceptable to all of us.
Well, I mean, this is a very literal example.
Yeah.
This is literally kind of marrying the old and the new, but this is something that happened completely by accident when I was playing. It's a favourite old song of mine from one of my favourite musicals, one of the greatest musicals of all time, Singing in the Rain, you know, so I've played it for some time. You know, usual chords.
I'm singing in the rain. Just singing in the rain. What a glorious feeling. I'm happy again.
You always, as an interviewer, you look at people who are kind of actually going to give you a bit more than Meg Ryan does, you know. They're going to talk a bit about themselves unflinchingly. You once said, too, that you would never been an artist had you not had Hodgkin's disease, which is a form of lymphatic cancer. Why was that? How did that determine your career?
Well,
you were, what, 20 at the time, 22
yeah, I was
at the
about
time.
22. I think there's 2 points of view. I think probably the reason I said that was because at that time, when you're sort of thinking you're trying to work out what you're going to do with your life, and you know, people around you, you know, totally with your sort of best interest at heart, try to dissuade you from, you know, going into a profession which is, you know, so chancy.
I had my portrait painted somewhat reluctantly, because I remember there's one great quote from somebody who said, a painter said, you paint a portrait and you lose a friend. And I think there might be truth in that. But what was interesting was you're flattered to be asked for the National Portrait. Of course you are. But what was interesting was that after I'd met Jonathan Yeo and I was sitting for him, I suddenly began to understand how much like my job his was, because he has to settle a stranger and make that stranger believe in a very short space of time that they've known each other for a long, long time and that they trust each other.
Portraits generally are most powerful if you're engaging someone directly, because if you get the eyes right and they pull you in, it's hard to sort of get away from it.
See, that engagement is exactly what interviewing is about. It is about an engagement. And if you don't engage, and sometimes that happens, it doesn't work. Do you get the same thing as a painter?
Yes. I mean, if you find someone very dull, that's a problem, because then chances are you'll find the picture less interesting and the whole thing will just sort of like not be much fun to do and therefore not much fun to look at.
If you don't care what people think about you or make of you, then in fact it's not going to be a very charming product. The chances are. But if you actually care and establish a rapport, you don't have to fall in love with you, but the fact of the matter is that they're going to explore you properly and sensitively, and it's the same with an interview. I
tend to start with big sort of patchy areas of colour, and sometimes they stay like that. The one we did for the Portrait Gallery, sort of that became the dynamic of the picture.
Yes.
Was using this heavy brush strokes to sort of like create sort of a movement and energy and sort of make the whole thing more engaging and sort of energised. And that may happen again too now. You can't do that so easily with younger faces. So it's fun doing it with sort of like kind of grown-ups, basically.
I've always felt that whenever I walk into a studio to do an interview, that there is no other job I would rather do. So from that point of view, you're looking at a very self-satisfied, smug man, actually.